This week on FX Guide TV.
We sit down for an in-depth one-on-one interview with Marcos Fajardo, founder of SolidAngle and the Arnold renderer.
This and more coming up next.
Hello and welcome to FX Guide TV. Before the show, I just want to give a plug for some of our other shows. In addition to this video podcast, we have several others, including our main FX podcast, where we speak to the people doing the work and explore the technologies they use. We also have our VFX show podcast, which is VFX Movie Review. Our panel discusses not just the film, but the actual effects shots and how well they worked. Plus more, including the RC and our regular pieces with our media partner Wired, called Design FX. Search for them, check them out on iTunes, or just look in the quick take section of FX Guide each week. But for now, here's Mike.
Marcus, thanks so much for joining us. So basically, I guess my first question would be, isn't the essence of Arnold trying to estimate the integral and do it with basically clever sampling? And if that is true, then it comes down to three things. You want to have not much noise, you want to do it as fast as you possibly can, and you want to manage memory. Would you agree with that?
I totally agree.
So how the heck did you get the last version to run so fast?
Well, I didn't. I have a team of engineers working on these problems, and all they do all day is just looking for places that can be improved. And when you thought that everything was perfect and couldn't be improved any longer, these guys, because they're so good, they always find spots, everything in the code that can be improved. And that's what we do continuously. We just debug. Basically, every time we release a new version, we get new assets from the customers, and we evaluate and debug and profile these new assets, which get more and more complex. So as the complexity rises, there appear new gaps in the code that we can fill that performance gap. So we're always looking at things. But that's a performance thing. As far as sampling, that's a never-ending battle.
Okay, but we've got
better.
these three things, right? Which is managing the memory footprint, the noise, and let's assume that the noise hasn't got worse because it hasn't, and then the speed of the rendering. So are you getting speed out of the memory, or are you getting speed out of just the algorithms for the solve?
Both. I mean, it could come from anywhere. There's a fourth axis that you didn't mention, which is scalability, multi-threading. So, as the machines get more and more cores and threads, that can become a bottleneck. Like your algorithms might scale very well up to 8 threads maybe, but then we're getting machines with 64 threads, and sometimes when you try these algorithms that you thought were scaling properly in 8 threads, now they don't with 64 threads. So that's a fourth axis that we're looking at, and there's always things there to improve.
In fact, you described multi-threading as the Achilles heel of production renderers, didn't you?
I did in the past, and now everybody's like, that's a problem we all have, and everybody's looking at that, and we've just been looking at that problem longer than others. So we have a head start on that.
Because it seems to me that one of the big things about Arnold, you talked about scalability, not just in terms of whether or not you're using the threads, but scalability in terms of being able to devote it to projects that have incredibly large sort of amounts of geometry, incredibly tough constraints. And of course, many people have written simple ray tracers, but it's the difference between that and actually handling the production environment.
That's true. I mean, there's a big difference between having a little toy ray tracer and having a production ray tracer that can handle these super complicated things. It's just the complexity keeps going up. It's crazy. Like when we rendered Gravity at Framestore, we thought that was like the biggest ever asset that we've ever rendered with Arnold. Fast forward to today, because Gravity was rendered almost 2.5 years ago or so. Today, Guardians of the Galaxy is like way much more complex than Gravity was. And we still find areas that can be improved, and we worked together with Framestore on the scalability and memory performance and things like that. So it's a never-ending battle.
I'm glad you brought up Framestore, because they're finding 5 times improvements on the procedurals. I mean, I'm not joking when I say, like, how are you guys managing to still find such significant gains? Like, you must have a really amazing team of researchers.
We do. It's not just the researchers, it's the systems engineers.
Right.
So research is one thing. You can do long-term research, but you need to, like I said, you need to get these assets from production, analyze them, debug them, profile them, and then you find all of these little problems. We have a great systems team that can find these problems and work on them really hard. And the thing about these problems is that they're very difficult. You need to spend a lot of energy on fixing these problems. And it's a challenge of how much effort you want to put into fixing one of these problems, because it's very easy to just throw the towel after a couple of days or a week. I don't throw the towel very easily. So when we find one of these things, I've got one engineer working on it, and he's like, this is as far as I can take it. And I'm like, I think you can take it much further. So give it another week, and just maybe have other engineers like contribute to or review what he's doing. And so instead of taking 1 week of work, that ends up taking maybe 1 month of work, but we push it to the last 20% or whatever, and that's how we get the software to run so quickly.
So overall, version 4.2, if I'm not mistaken, is getting about 25 to 50% improvements on these higher end production shots we're talking about. This is a pretty significant gain.
It is. So, and yeah, I mean, the range of speed up, it really depends on the scene and the particular features that you are using on that particular shot. But I mean, just without doing anything, we're seeing, like you said, 25 to 50% improvement. If you're doing if you're doing a lot of transparency and backlighting, there's a lot of speed up in there. Memory also has been reduced, scalability as well. 4.2 is a major big release. I mean, there's like 5 months of work in there. So there's all kinds of optimizations across the board.
Now, as fast as that is going on the CPU, here at the show, there's rumors of a GPU implementation of Arnold with AMD. What's that about?
Yeah, well, we are experimenting with different technologies, and Arnold runs on the CPU 100%, but GPUs are getting more and more powerful. There's different vendors doing different things, and we can't just ignore that. So we're taking a look at all these things. We're looking at how much power, how much compute power is in there, how can we take advantage of it. This particular thing with AMD, I mean, they have a great GPU, and they have some APIs that we can take advantage of. So we're looking at whether we can take advantage of that or not. But it's pretty much just an experiment. I mean, it might or might not work out.
But it's an OpenCL experiment, isn't it?
Yeah. I think it is an API that AMD provides that under the hood uses OpenCL.
I mean, I guess the question is, could you do a CUDA version? Could you go to an NVIDIA?
We are going to be looking at different things, but AMD does not
no, of
do
course
that.
They don't, but yeah.
But yeah, we're going to be looking at everything. I mean, we don't know yet what's the best path going forward. Like rewriting your software to work on the GPU is very complicated, and in fact, it might be impossible. Like it's just not possible to port Arnold or any complex software to the GPU. You have to have an alternate code path. And that just increases the software development complexity by hugely. So we just have to be very careful on how to do it. It's not clear what direction would be the best and long term. So we just have to keep an eye on everything and just make sure we understand the implications of all of these different code
I'm
paths.
absolutely no expert, but I would have thought that the biggest problem is going to be memory arbitration on the GPU.
That's one of the problems. And the interesting thing about the AMD thing is that they have a lot of memory. So I think the machine they gave us for evaluation had 16 gigabytes on the GPU. So that's pretty interesting. So yeah, I mean, different hardware has different limitations of memory. But yeah, memory is a problem because our big scenes will not feed in 8 gigabytes of memory. So
while we're talking about things that are just being announced at the moment, Arnold's got stuff that, or rather, is able to work now with Houdini and Cinema 4D?
Correct. We just demoed the Houdini plugin this week at SIGGRAPH, and also the Cinema 4D plugin. The Houdini plugin is actually released this week. There's a release candidate, actually. And the Cinema 4D plugin will be released later during the year, but it's looking pretty sweet. I'm liking what I'm seeing. And the Houdini plugin has actually been used in production for the last year while we were beta testing it. So there's people like Framestore, The Mill, and Psyop, and a bunch of others who have already been using Arnold on Houdini, and they're so happy with it. The good thing about the Houdini plugin is that it makes the pipeline easier, because usually you have this communication problem between, a studio might be using Maya for most of the things, and then Houdini for effects, and sending things back and forth always becomes a problem. There's always something there that doesn't quite right. With the Arnold plugin for Houdini, that just becomes so much easier.
So let's just talk about the basis of what you're doing. You have a sort of a philosophy, really, to not use tricks in terms of like, it's not a series of clever, I'm not going to say hacks, but there are some rendering models that sort of break the problem out more into pre-renders and pre-comps. And it seems to me that one of the philosophies of Arnold has always been to be much more direct in terms of how it's approaching things. But it is a unidirectional path tracer. Why not go down a bidirectional path tracing path and combine it with something like a VCM or something else?
Yeah, why not? I mean, we're exploring different things. Like right now, Arnold is a unidirectional path tracer. It's not as easy as it sounds to just make it bidirectional. There's a bunch of things that you have to re-architect internally to make that happen. The shaders have to be bidirectional, and a lot of the shaders that our customers write are not bidirectional. So there's a bunch of stuff in there that has to be re-architected a little bit, but there's definitely something that we're going to be looking at. In fact, you mentioned VCM that was developed by Ilian, and Ilian now works with us. So.
Well, that's what I was going to get to, actually, because he is one of the researchers that's been very prominent in this area. It's terrific that he's now working with you. I was wondering if we could talk about some of the other aspects of the algorithmic stuff that you guys do. So for a start, we were talking recently, like I think a year ago, you and I, about subsurface scattering, and at that time you were going on about how you'd got new importance sampling for subsurface. Can you just talk a bit more about that? Because that's obviously a very important thing for many people.
Yeah, subsurface scattering is a difficult, hard problem that we are looking at. There's every year at SIGGRAPH and other conferences, there's new papers investigating how to make it look better and how to make it faster. And we're definitely looking at everything, and we are continuously working on improving it. We now have some new subsurface scattering technology that we're playing with that's looking really nice. I can't give you much more details on that, but eventually this will be released and we'll talk about it.
Because your current approach is like a multi-sampling approach as opposed to a single sampling approach, isn't it? So it's already like, really pushing the envelope pretty hard.
Well, I think we were the first to identify that there's a sampling problem in there and actually solve it. So we solve it by using the various sampling techniques, including multiple importance sampling. Eric Vich is multiple importance sampling. In actually two areas of the problem, which is one of them is that we're selecting the direction in which we are sampling the surface with using multiple importance sampling, and two, we're selecting the layer within the subsurface scattering model. Like usually you have a profile for the red component, another one for the green component, another one for the blue component. So we can like randomly select between these things. This is all something we describe in the technical papers that we publish for this, but it's looking great. It scales very well, which is this ties back with what I was saying about threading scalability.
Yeah.
So this technique, because it's fully Monte Carlo based, it just scales very well. So there's no bottleneck, there's no pre-computation, it just scales very well.
But while we're on subsurface scattering, one of the things that certainly has been pretty much in Maxwell since the outset, but now we're seeing in Manuka, is spectral rendering. Spectral rendering may be most significant in terms of subsurface and skin because, of course, it's very wavelength dependent. Is that something that interests you to look at?
It's very interesting. We don't currently support spectral rendering, and we don't have short-term plans to implement it. It's just one of those things that it really depends on what you're doing, and I don't see a lot of customers asking for spectral rendering. There's a few applications where that might make a big difference, but it's not something like critical and fundamental that we must have for film production render. So it's something that would be cool to have, but we're not doing actively any serious work on that area. I mean, there's a bunch of other people who've investigated the problem. We know how the thing works, and if we eventually need it, we'll have it. It's not one of the things that we need to have right now. I'd rather make the software twice faster now than work on spectral rendering, because that would benefit all of my customers right away. And spectral rendering I don't think it will benefit anybody right now, maybe a few customers. Yeah,
though I think it would be safe to say that a number of things like spectral rendering, it's not so much that a customer really wants spectral rendering, as much as they want, an improvement to skin, which by sort of definition, you guys solve the problem by coming up with the algorithmic solutions that may or may not involve something like spectral rendering. Because I don't think most clients, our customers, have, apart from serious TDs, at SIGGRAPH pumping the papers, but they kind of expect that you are, and you're going to pick the best of the lot. So I guess you and the other team are pretty present here at SIGGRAPH in terms of going to those technical papers. You published yourself, was it last year or the year before, a volumetric paper that was very interesting that led to, I believe, being able to have volumes such as like fire as light emitters. Is that right?
Yeah, so in EGSR 2012, we published a paper jointly with Sony Pictures Imageworks, Chris Kula at Imageworks. And there were two neat things in that paper. One is describe equiangular sampling, which is a technique for sampling, for doing ray marching when you have lights within your medium. That works great, it's beautiful. We showed how to combine that with multiple importance sampling with some of the other sampling techniques that people were using in the past, and the combination makes the thing more robust. As far as fire, that's something that you could do before. It's not really something specific about this technique that makes fire easier. The problem with fire is that you might have like a flame, like a small flame, and that becomes an emitter, right? So if that flame is very small and you have a unidirectional path tracer that fires rays randomly, it's going to be difficult to find that flame, so you're going to get a lot of noise. So that's where things like bidirectional path tracing would help, where you would actually fire rays from the flame. So it's not really, that's another discussion. The paper that we presented in 2012 is more about efficient single scattering. So like, the fog and smoke, if we fill this room with smoke right now, if there's people smoking here, like these area lights over here would get this beautiful, scattering in the air. That's the kind of thing that we do very well.
Yeah, it's become an important part of effects rendering to be able to do those good, volumetrics, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it used to be the case where you would have to have two renders, where you would have one render for doing surfaces and another render for doing volumes, and then you would have to comp the results of those two renders, and comping was always problematic because of, the masks would have to be special and you would have to use some deep compositing. It was problematic. Today, fast forward to today, and you can do all of these things in the same render, so that simplifies the pipeline enormously.
So if we were looking at bidirectional path tracing, I presume you'd also be looking at things like metropolis transports, and because it seems to me that there's a lot of research being published at the moment in that and manifold and extending out from there. How do you feel the research is at the moment? Has it settled down, or is it like breaking through?
No, there's quite a renaissance now on light transport. There's a lot of different people doing new research on light transport algorithms, and that's all cool. It's beautiful, and we're getting some really cool results. Not all of those algorithms can make it into production render right away. It's very common to publish a beautiful research paper about these things, but usually these papers don't consider all the things that you have to have in a production render. Things like huge texture data sets that might affect how, when you fire rays from the light rather than from the camera, you might or might not pull the right texture MIPS and stuff like that. So there's a bunch of little, practical problems that have to be addressed before you can actually use one of these advanced global illumination algorithms in a production render. Again, we're looking at everything. We're keeping an eye on all of this research, and when we're ready, we'll have something that's better than plain old unidirectional path tracing. But actually, unidirectional path tracing seems to work fairly well for like a wide range of what people need to do in production today. So even if we didn't have bidirectional path tracing, unidirectional path tracing works actually pretty well in almost everything that you throw at it.
Yeah, it's obviously a bit of a buzz thing, talking about bidirectional, though it obviously does have its uses.
It is.
Though you made a point, I think, yesterday in a talk that the main contribution to any scene is, of course, direct lighting. Most things are lit by direct lighting. And I think you were discussing probability distribution functions and cumulative distribution functions. And then you sort of went from that onto why you thought importance sampling was something we should care about in the first place. We mentioned importance sampling a lot. Do you want to just discuss your philosophy on that?
Yeah, everybody talks about these new global illumination algorithms, and that's great. But if you don't first solve the sub-problem of direct lighting, it does not matter how good your GI algorithm is, you're going to get a crappy image full of noise. So both problems are important. The local lighting and the global lighting, those two problems have to be solved really well. And yeah, what I basically said, because there were all the speakers covering the light transport thing so well, I just wanted to concentrate on the other part of the problem that people are not talking too much about, but it's still a critical part of the problem.
So do you want to elaborate on that?
Sure. So at the talk yesterday, I showed 3 examples of importance sampling for the direct lighting computation. One of them was big area lights. When you have a big area light and you have objects close to the area light, the prevalent technique that everybody has been using until now was area sampling combined with BRDF sampling through multiple importance sampling. And we showed that that can be improved by using, by changing doing a change of variables in the lighting equation and sampling not just the area of the light, but the projected area on the sphere. So your flat area light becomes a spherical quad. So we have a beautiful technique to sample a spherical quad.
So you're talking about better sampling across the spherical quad, across the solid angle? You're talking about having a more even distribution?
Yeah, so if you were to sample your area light uniformly in the area space,
then it's not uniform.
When you project that to your shading point, you don't get a uniform distribution of points on the projected solid angle.
Yeah.
And that's the term that actually shows up in the equation, so it's much better to importance sample that term by doing uniform sampling on the spherical quad. So that's just one particular example. And this is work that was started years ago by Jim Arbo. He provided these equations for spherical triangles. But in production, we rarely use triangles. We use, lights are usually rectangles. So we just provided a small improvement to that case. When you have rectangular lights, we now know how to sample those very efficiently. So that was just one example. The other example was our subsurface scattering sampling technique that we introduced a few years ago. That is direct lighting. So we basically have a way to compute the BSSRDF illumination with Monte Carlo and using importance sampling, and we describe that. You basically want to take into consideration the shape of the diffusion profile. Usually the diffusion profile is like a monotonically decreasing function that's very smooth, and there are ways to importance sample that function, and we showed how to do that. And the third example that we showed yesterday was volume rendering. We talked about that a little bit earlier, the single scattering component, and that's really important. And we showed exactly what equations we are using and why we did that work. And all together, if you have all of these sub-problems solved very well, you end up with a system that's very robust and it produces very little noise. And over time, I'm sure we'll find more places where we can improve these importance sampling algorithms even more.
So obviously it is key to get the sort of direct light right, and we've discussed that. But can I now go to the other end of the spectrum and ask you about the more obscure corners of rendering? What about some of the areas of research that are going on at the moment in terms of a non-uniform refractive index, sort of heat hazy type things? Is that something that you've looked at?
Well, we always keep an eye on all of these interesting rendering problems, but that ends up in what we call predictive rendering area, where, if you're doing Spider-Man 3, 4, 5, whatever, you probably don't need that kind of stuff unless it's a very specific shot that's looking at something very close up. So those super obscure corners of rendering, what we call predictive rendering, where you definitely want to produce an image that is as accurate as possible, like numerically, we don't really use a lot of that in film production rendering. It's great when we can find one of these obscure corners and incorporate it into the main production render, but it's not a driving force for what we do. It's something that's cool to keep in mind and look at it, but there are different applications.
Yeah,
I'll give you an example. In predictive rendering, there's research being done on polarization.
Yeah.
How often do you need to have a polarization enabled or capable render for film production and commercials? I've never seen a need for that. But it's there, the research is there.
Okay, but let me challenge you on this, because I would have had this discussion with other people, not you, in the past, and I've said, what about caustics? And they said, well, caustics is a bit of a special case. How often do you need to render a swimming pool throwing up light on a wall? It's just not that often. And yet today, we would argue that if you're doing very accurate faces, you need to do caustics inside the light, inside the way that the lens works on the eye. And so a major production company would literally be caring about caustics because it unevenly lights across an eye, giving a much more realistic view. It's moved it from being fairly special case obtuse to, okay, well, maybe it's not for everybody, but certainly there are some people that care about it a lot. So there are, as we learn different approaches to different things, some of these things do move from the fringe to the mainstream a little bit more.
It's true, but some of these things fall into the light transport main theme, and we are definitely looking at that. Some of these other things are like, corner cases that are interesting, but might or might not be ever usable. These things evolve over time anyway. So, I'm saying this today, but, I don't know what we're saying 2 years down the line where, maybe something changes in the pipelines all over the studios, and we have to look at some of these.
I love how you think 2 years down the line is a really long time.
Well, I'm concerned about what's going on today. Like, we have customers all over the world doing projects today, and they're amazing projects, very complicated films and projects that we need to help right now. So that's where we spend most of our work. Solid Angle is not a company that does super long-term research, we do a tiny little bit of that, but we were concerned with practical problems. Arnold is a great production tool because we're concerned with today, with now. These are your big data sets, we need to be able to render that right now. And complexity, we know that complexity keeps growing year over year, things get more and more complicated, so that's where we put our development effort. We have a limited amount of developers and effort, so we put that in there, while keeping an eye on the future, on some of these
so
more
where does
fewer
Caustics
things.
sit on that spectrum of things that you're worried about?
Caustics are great, are beautiful. How often do you need caustics in a film? It depends on the film. It depends on the quality that you want. It's something that we want to be able to render eventually. Right now we can render soft caustics. To render good caustics, you need some form of bi-directional techniques. So, which is something that we're looking at. So once we have that nailed, caustic will just fold naturally into this thing.
Okay, so what about hair? Because if we look at, say, some other renderers out there, like you'd probably say that RSI's, RenderMan's implementation is not so hair-friendly. Manuka at the other end loves hair and seems to render it really, really well. Where does Arnold fit in terms of hair? Very common problem.
Yeah, Arnold loves hair. We have an amazingly efficient hair primitive, and that's one of the areas that we're continuously improving. So more and more we're getting, Friendster for Guardians of the Galaxy, one of the main characters, if not the main character, is this raccoon. It's got a ton of hair in there. It's in every single shot, super close-ups. So, hair for us is just as important as polygons. It's just another first-class citizen of the rendering world for us. And we've been working on making that faster for years, and we'll continue to do so. Both at the geometry level and at the shading level, there's a ton of work still to be done there, and we'll definitely make that. That is one of our top priorities.
It's an interesting problem though, isn't it? Because you would think that hair kind of gets solved, but there's a range of different types of hair. And once you get these super fine hairs, which can be important sometimes for peach fuzz or even for eyebrows and other things, you get almost translucency to the hairs. It becomes a really complicated rendering problem. Kind of fascinating, actually.
It is. There's a lot of research being done right now on hair fiber scattering. And we use some of that research, and we will use more of that as the research becomes more established and better solutions pop up. But that, for us, is an amazingly interesting area to look into, and we're always looking into that. In fact, today there was a series of talks on hair rendering. That's all really cool stuff, and something that's directly applicable to what we do in different levels. Like I said, geometrical. Basically you have to have millions of hairs, and you need to be able to efficiently ray trace these beautiful soft splines, curved splines. So that's one purely geometrical problem. Then there's a shading problem, like the scattering. Light comes in, and how does it scatter through the hair? So that's a lot of research, like I said, and it is an integral part of what we do. And we're going to have better and better hair in every release, and yeah.
One of the big areas that I love is depth-based compositing and the sort of stuff that you can do with that, because basically it's extending 3D into 2D really, really well. You guys support the OpenEXR extension with Deep. I'm just wondering, is that an area that's now stabilized, or do you think there's more work to be done in that area?
It's pretty much stable as far as I can tell. For us in Arnold, there's a couple of things that we can make to make that even faster and more efficient. We're always looking at things like compression techniques for that. Volumes are, you have to have the right settings and the right things for compositing volumes.
Because your volumes support OpenVDB, by the way, don't they, as well? I forgot to mention that before.
Yeah, so, but that's a separate discussion.
Yeah,
so for deep compositing, you need to be able to provide a deep image that has both surfaces and volumes in it. Like right now, we're working on improving our volume support for deep compositing, but it's pretty straightforward. Once you have the basics covered, it's pretty stable as far as I can tell.
Well, it's been great talking to you, and thanks also for the party on the yacht the other night. That was like a whole lot of fun.
Yeah, that was great, wasn't it? So yeah, we've been preparing that for quite a long time, and we wanted to make something special this year. This year's been the biggest SIGGRAPH for us ever. We've got like 11 people from the company attending, It's just been really stressing for me to get everything ready, but everything went so smoothly, and we were just very happy to be here and talking to everybody at SIGGRAPH.
So 4.2 was a major release for you. In fact, I was kind of surprised it wasn't 5. So what's the roadmap looking forward? Like, what is the next major release coming, and when can customers expect to see that? And if at all possible, what's in it?
So this year we're focusing on the 4.2 series, which is most of it, it's about performance. Like we know a few areas, we have identified a few areas that can be improved dramatically, and we're going to be working on those. So we're just going to keep making Arnold faster and better. That's for this year. For next year, we were thinking about Arnold 5. There's going to be a lot of cool stuff in there. Some of that I can't really say at this moment, but that's just longer term.
Any hints as to what areas 5 might be looking at, just in broad terms? In other words, is it features? Is it more performance? Is it?
There's going to be a major architectural rewrite. There's going to be a lot of new shading work and a lot of new cool stuff.
Okay, well, we'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for taking time to talk to us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for this week. And you know what? It's only a few more shows until our 200th ep. Wow, 200 eps. It's hard to believe. Anyway, watch out for that coming up. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at fxguidenews or on Facebook. Until next time, see ya. For more industry news, in-depth features, podcasts and forums, check out fxguide.com. And for visual effects training, check out fxphd.com.